Hey, what's up everybody? This is C.L.S. all-in-one. In today's video, I'll show you how we built a 4-foot concrete retaining wall. So we built this wall to help hold back some dirt on our property as our land sits higher and slopes down toward our neighbors. And then we eventually built a fence on top of this to divide the properties. So to start with, I needed to make a concrete footing for the wall. And since my wall is 8 inches thick, I wanted my footing to be around 16 inches wide and 12 inches thick. So I've dug a hole here for the footing that can accommodate those dimensions. Now I would like to mention before doing a job like this, you should always check with your local building codes to know what is or isn't allowed, so you don't have to do a job twice. So with this particular setup, I will not be using any forms for the footing because I've already dug the hole at very close to the exact dimensions needed. So now I can just use these dirt walls as a natural form for the concrete. Now depending on what your soil composition is, you may have to add gravel to the bottom of the hole to provide adequate drainage. But since my soil consists of pretty much just sand and rock, no gravel is necessary for this job. Next, I will start adding some rebar to this hole. And for this, I'll be using some 1/2-inch rebar. And I will be doubling this up with 2 horizontal rows spanning all the way across the length of this hole. And to keep it off the ground, I'll be using some concrete pavers that I had lying around. But you could also use some rebar chairs for this step as well. And with this setup, once I start pouring the concrete for the footing, I will be lifting up on the rebar just a little bit so that the concrete can be poured underneath all areas of the rebar. And the end goal is to have the horizontal rebar be located about 4 inches from the bottom. Now I will cut multiple pieces of rebar at 2-foot lengths. Then make a 6-inch bend on each of these to create a L-shaped bar. And these will be used for vertical supports on the footing and will be tied to the horizontal rebar. So I will be installing 2 of these tied together like this at every 2 foot spanning across the length of the footing. And to tie these together, I'm using some double loop rebar wire ties along with a rebar wire twisting tool. So as you can see here, I have 2 horizontal rows of rebar that are doubled up along with 2 L-bars at every 2 foot. Then I tied in a horizontal piece of rebar to the top of the L-bars to help hold everything in place until the footing is poured. And this piece of rebar is just temporary and will be removed after the footing cures. Now it's time to start pouring some concrete, and I will be using a concrete mixer along with 60-pound bags of concrete mix. To figure out how much you need, you can use an online concrete calculator. For this job, my footing is 16 inches wide by 12 inches thick by 12 feet long. So I need approximately 36 bags of 60-pound concrete mix. But you should always plan on getting at least a couple extra bags to account for any waste or other unforeseen issues. As far as the consistency goes with the concrete mix, it should somewhat resemble a thick oatmeal mix with no dry clumps. During the concrete pour, you'll want to make sure to compact the concrete by tamping it with a bar or shovel to ensure there's no voids in the concrete. Then once it's filled to the desired height, you'll want to make sure the surface is somewhat level, then use a trowel to smooth out the surface. And you don't have to get too carried away with the finish on this footing because all of this will be covered up eventually anyway. So at this point, this is the following day, but I need to let this cure for a minimum of at least 3 days before I build on top of this. And as you can see here, I went ahead and removed that top piece of temporary 1/2-inch rebar that was helping hold the vertical rebar in place. Next, I will start building the forms. For this, you can rent actual concrete forms or make your own with 5/8 of an inch or thicker plywood or OSB, which is what I'll be using. Now I will go ahead and grease the side of the forms that will be coming in contact with the concrete. And for this, diesel works great. You can just apply it with a rag, and this will keep the concrete from sticking to the forms. So my retaining wall will be 4 foot tall, so this 4x8 sheet will work great. Now I just need to reinforce it with some 2x4s, with one screwed at the top, middle, and bottom. And since my wall will be 12 feet long, I'm using some 12-foot long 2x4s, so I can add on another 4-foot section of OSB to this form. But because this is already pretty heavy as it is, I will go ahead and assemble the rest of this on top of the footing. So here's a look at what I've done so far. And now it's time to go ahead and bring this over to the footing. So the form should just sit flush on top of the footing, and as long as your footing is level, your form should be as well. This retaining wall will be 8 inches thick, so I will place this section 4 inches off the center of the footing, and make sure it's plumb. Then begin securing it with 2x4 supports on the back side. And to attach these, I've used 3-inch screws where it meets the horizontal 2x4s, and concrete form stakes along with screws at the other end. And eventually I'll have at least 2 supports within every 4 feet on this side. Now I will start adding vertical supports to the form with a 4-foot 2x4 secured to the horizontal 2x4s at every 2 foot with 3-inch screws. Then, after securing the first section of this form, I installed another 4-foot by 4-foot piece of OSB and secured that as well. And wherever a seam is located, I make sure to install a 2x4 on the back side of it to make sure the form does not fail and have a blowout at the seam. So all I have to do here is center it at the seam, then secure it with 1.5-inch screws from the other side. And here's a look at the first form that is level and plumb and has all of its supports installed. Now I will measure over 8 inches from the first form and begin marking where the next form will go. And since this new retaining wall will be tied into an existing wall, I've made some marks on that as well, and I've also made some marks on the wall for rebar tie-ins at every 1 foot. Now I will use a hammer drill with a 1/2-inch masonry bit and drill to a depth of 3 inches. Then apply some construction adhesive to the end of a 1-foot long piece of 1/2-inch rebar and drive it into the wall 3 inches. And just to let you know, with this new retaining wall, I was only able to line this up flush on one side with this existing wall because I had to stay inside my property boundary line, which is very close to the line drawn on the wall. So for this next step, you can just buy some concrete form ties, which can get a little pricey, or make your own with these Simpson strong ties. These are priced at right around $1.60 each and worked great for this project. To use these, I just marked 2 lines on each tie at 8 inches apart, with the 8 inches being centered on each tie, because I want my wall to be 8 inches thick. Then I used a multi-tool with a 1-inch wide blade to make cuts on the form to create slots that these ties can slide through. So right here, I'm making a cut just above one of the horizontal 2x4s. Then I push and pull the tie through until it lines up with one of my marks on the inside of the form. Then on the outside of the form, I bend the excess over the 2x4 and secure it with a structural rated screw. And my goal for this 4-foot wall is to install these at every 2 foot starting from the middle up to the top. And the purpose of these is to tie or lock the forms together, and this will keep them from spreading apart from each other when I begin pouring the concrete. So before installing the other side of the form, I need to build a rebar grid in the center of where the wall will be located. And again for this, I'm using some 1/2-inch rebar that will be doubled up, and I'd recommend to have the vertical rebar installed within at least every 2 feet, and the same for the horizontal rebar. So this rebar grid will be tied into the vertical rebar on the footing, and also the horizontal rebar that I added to the existing wall. And when you build a grid such as this, you want to make sure to keep the rebar at least 2 to 3 inches away from the outside edges so that the concrete can form a proper structural bond. So at this point, I'm just about done with this grid, and I got quite a bit of leftover rebar. So I will go ahead and add a few extra rows of horizontal rebar. And now it's time to build the other form with the OSB panels and 2x4s. Then I need to measure where the Simpson strong ties were installed on the first form. Then use these measurements to mark where I need to make my cuts on the second form. And now this form is ready to install, but first, I want to go ahead and add some 8-inch 2x4 spacer blocks to the inside middle area of the first form, and secure these with 1 screw from the back side. And I will also add a few more of these to the outside edges once the other form is in place. These blocks will help keep the wall forms spaced at exactly 8 inches from each other, and I will keep these in place until the concrete gets poured and starts to get close to reaching these spacers. Now we will go ahead and install the other form, and to make things easier, I slightly bent these strong ties upward so they're out of the way. Then we place the form in the hole at a slight angle, then began pushing the ties through the bottom holes first by just a few inches, then did the same thing with the top row, and kept repeating these steps until the second form was flush with the spacer blocks. Now, with the form pushed tightly against the blocks in the middle areas, the strong ties can be bent over the 2x4 edge and secured with structural screws. Then, more spacer blocks can be added to the outside edges, and after that, the remaining strong ties can be secured. Next, I will add some vertical 4-foot 2x4s at every 2 foot going across. Then some wall supports can be added within every 4 feet, and these are secured to the form with 3-inch screws at the top, then secured with a form stake and a 2-inch screw at the bottom. So on this side of the form, I will not be adding a second lower row of supports like I did on the other side, because this side is not as deep, and it can be easily filled with dirt at the bottom edge, which will secure the bottom of this form. And when it's time to remove these forms, I should be able to dig this side out fairly easy. Next, I need to cap off the exposed ends of the forms with more OSB, and I will also be adding a few fence posts to the inside of these forms because I will be installing a fence on top of the retaining wall. Now this next step covers how to add some optional drain ports to a retaining wall, and for this I'll be using a drill with a 2 1/8 inch hole saw bit and some 2-inch PVC pipe. So normally when installing drain ports like this, you'll want it to be located very close to the bottom of the wall, somewhere around 6 inches from the bottom. And the purpose of this is to help relieve any hydrostatic pressure that may build up from water on the buried side of the wall. But with this setup, I do have a neighbor located on the low side of where this wall will be, and he mentioned he does not want the wall draining on his side on a regular basis. So we came to a compromise and decided to mount the drain ports up higher on the wall, and I will also be backfilling the back side of the retaining wall with sand and drainage rock, so under normal conditions the water level should stay below these ports. Now it's time to start mixing concrete again, and since this wall will be 12 feet long by 4 feet tall by 8 inches thick, the volume of that adds up to 32 cubic feet, and one 60-pound bag of concrete covers around 0.45 cubic feet, so I will need at least 72 bags of 60-pound concrete, which equals a lot of labor even with a concrete mixer. And the easiest way to get the concrete in the forms was to just use a 5-gallon bucket. This at first seemed like it would take forever, but with a little help from the family, it went by much faster. And while pouring the concrete, I made sure my fence posts stayed nice and plumb. Then, after pouring the concrete to a depth of approximately 1 foot, I began packing it with a bar. And I also tapped the side of the forms to help the concrete settle even more, then repeated these steps at every 1 foot of concrete poured. Then, once the concrete level began to reach the bottom of the spacer blocks, I made sure to remove them. So at this point, my helpers had to go, but there's just a few buckets left to pour. Then I can start using a trowel to work and shape the concrete. For the most part, all I used was a trowel, but in some areas I used a float as well. And you could also use an edger to round the corners, but for this wall, I don't feel it's needed. For the most part, I just concentrated on sealing the edges and made sure the surface was level. And now this pour is done, and I just need to wait at least 48 hours before removing the forms. And as you can see here, we went ahead and added our handprints to the top of this wall. Now it's time to remove the forms, and I will start first with removing the supports. Then the vertical 2x4s. Then loosen the strong tie straps. Then dig the bottom of the form out and start yanking it loose. And because the straps were kind of holding the form from coming all the way loose, I found it was easier to just tap them out of the form with a hammer on the inside. Then the wall was able to be pulled loose much easier. So right here I'm using a long pry bar to raise the form, so I can get up underneath of it and drag it out. Then I'll do the same thing on the other side, except for this side I cut it in 2 pieces because that last one was a little bit heavy. Now the straps can be broken off by bending them up and down. Then I will cut the drain ports flush with the wall using a multi-tool. Then the concrete will need to cure for around 7 days before backfilling, and during that time the wall can be misted with water a few times a day to help it cure. And after 7 days, you can also seal the concrete before backfilling to give it an extra layer of protection. And as I mentioned earlier, on the back side of this wall, I used a combination of drainage rock and sand for backfilling it, which will allow any water to drain much easier around this wall. Okay, it's now time for me to go. If you liked this video, if you could hit that like button, and please subscribe. And have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.